is a shir on Likutei Sichos, Chelek Tes Vov, Sicha Breishis, second Sicha. On the pasuk in which Hashem describes the creation, the beginning of Breishis, and it says, "Yihima Eres, let there be luminaries in the sky, and v'hoyu lo'ises, they shall be for signs." Rashi brings what our sages tell us. When the luminaries are smitten, when they, in other words, we're talking here about an eclipse, so then it's a bad sign for the world. As it says in the pasuk, don't be scared of the signs that come to you from heaven, etc. This is the pasuk. Because when you do, Rashi is continuing to quote from Chazal, when you do the wish of Hashem, this is the Gemara in Sukkah, when you do the will of Hashem, you don't have to worry about punishment, about puranus, about negativity happening. When it comes to the reason about why the luminaries of the sky are sometimes loikin, are smitten, in other words, they're not visible to us, they're eclipsed, they're darkened. So the Gemara says in Sukkah, because of four things, the sun becomes eclipsed, is darkened. One of the things is the head of the Beis Din, the Av Beis Din, who passes away and is not eulogized appropriately. In other words, the generation didn't recognize the loss of the great leader, etc. That's one of the things. And then the Gemara continues, and because of four things, the Ma'ores, the luminaries. The first Gemara we just quoted was about the sun. Now we're talking about the luminaries, including the moon. There are four things that cause them to be eclipsed. And one of them is, the first one, the Rabbi here quotes only, the first one is those that write forged documents that they want to be attributed to somebody who never wrote it, etc. In other words, the eclipse that takes place, the sun and the moon, and the heavenly bodies, is connected, is brought about by the deeds of man. That's the simple reading of the Gemara. So it's well known the question, the fact that there are eclipses, the fact that we don't see the sun and the moon, it's a scientific fact. It's an astronomical fact. It's it's embedded within creation. We know scientifically that they come in pre-appointed times. And therefore you can predict in advance and calculate when those eclipses will take place. So how is it then? Because it has to do with what we see, with the positioning of the sun and the moon and the planets. So how can the Gemara then say that these things are caused by particular sins and misdeeds by mankind down below, where we know that it's a factual reality? Rabbi here in Ois Beis, the second chapter of the Sikha, gives us an insight into how we have to look at questions in general, questions about faith, about things that it says in the Torah. So Rabbi says, certain people throughout the generations utilize this kasha, this question, in order to prove, to show, and Rabbi puts that word in inverted commas, to show that, God forbid, not everything that it says in the writings of our sages is correct. Because you see, they wrote about eclipse happening because of the deeds of man. So obviously they had some primitive understanding that what we do here causes eclipses, but really that's not the case. We know scientifically today, we know the reality is that those are preordained, those are natural things which we can predict. It's not a prediction. We know that it's going to happen. That's the trajectory and the orbits. And the people use this question to show, you see, this justifies their behavior in, God forbid, not doing Torah mitzvahs. Says that ever the truth is, when somebody doesn't do Torah mitzvahs, it has nothing to do with his intellectual questions. It has to do with the appetite, with the desire for indulgence that comes from his midas, that comes from his emotional attributes. He's being pulled by his heart to do things that the Torah forbids you to do. And the questions are just an expression to be able to answer why he's acting in a way that's inappropriate. And so, for that purpose, it's enough just to ask a question that sounds like a question. Ask a question. You see, it can't be that the words of our sages are correct because they talk about eclipses coming because of the deeds of man. And we know it's a predictable thing. It's got to do with astronomy. And that's already enough. That's why the person says he's not keeping. See, so the words of the sages, he's not keeping Torah mitzvahs. Okay. If he's really motivated by the fact he doesn't want to keep Torah mitzvahs because he has a desire for an indulgences that the Torah doesn't allow. So that kind of a question is a good enough excuse, but it's a question that it's really a very um, light question, because if you think about it just briefly, just not even so deeply, the Rebbe says it's beinus kalo, just a regular, an easy, thinking about it, you get to understand that the question, and here the word question is in inverted commas, like the strong question, it doesn't really have any reality, and it doesn't really have any basis. And now we're going to introduce, says the Rebbe Bakdom, and first let me preface the following. Everybody agrees that in the times of the Tanoim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, the Amirah, the rabbis of the Gemara, the calculations of eclipses, the sun and the moon, were well known by um, the wise people of the other nations. And everybody that knows a little bit of the history, the Jewish history, from the stories that are told in the words of our sages, and even more when you look in the books that record history of those days. So you know that there was a close connection between the wise people of the other nations and the wise people, the Chachmei Yisrael, the wise men of the Jewish people, in matters of wisdom, in matters of science. And we even find various places that there were debates about various wisdoms and astronomy. And even if somebody wants to ein action, somebody wants to be obstinate and say, and doesn't want to take on our traditional understanding that the science and the calculations of astronomy really started from Chachmei Yisrael, started from the Jewish sages, and through the Jewish sages it was transmitted. That's how that information first came to the sages of the world, to the wise people of the world. So even if you don't want to learn that traditional understanding that it started with the wisdom that was held by the Jewish sages, regardless of that, it's a clear thing, and you can't argue about the fact that when the calculations of eclipses was well known by the non-Jewish sages, they were definitely also known by the Jewish sages because of the connection, the interaction that took place with the sages of the world, especially when it came to astronomy, because the knowledge of the movements of the celestial bodies is relevant to the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. The Beis Din has to be able to calculate when the moon will be sighted. So they had to be very in tune with all the knowledge of astronomy. And therefore it's obvious, emphasized by the Rebbe, Pashut, it's obvious that this saying that our sages said that the eclipses of the sun and the moon is a negative sign to the world and they come because of four things, because of the deeds of man, it cannot be in contradiction to the fact that eclipses are something that are embedded into the nature. So maybe there's some very interesting footnotes. Perhaps perhaps later I'll jump back to them. L'chayr, Gimel. L'chayr would be able to learn that what the Gemara says, that the luminaries become eclipsed, it's a bad sign. So the emphasis here is that not the actual eclipse. That is something that's already embedded within nature, and we know when it's going to happen in advance if we understand all the calculations. But what we're talking about is when that eclipse is visible, then it's a negative sign. In other words, when Hashem allows this eclipse to be visible, then it means it's a negative sign. And it means the Jews have to do teshuvah. So to do teshuvah, you have to see the sign. So then you could answer the question simply by saying that, yes, eclipses are there in nature. It's imperative. It's going to happen. Something Hashem embedded in nature. And you can know it in advance. However, it's not necessary that that will be visible because there could be clouds that will cover up that eclipse, right? And then you wouldn't notice it. And that detail about whether or not the world sees it, humans see it, that is dependent on what people do. In other words, what it's saying is when there are the four things that are done, negative things, those four things would bring about the negativity of an eclipse. Not that the actual eclipse is brought about to them, but that the eclipse will be visual by the people on earth. And when people act properly, then there'll be things that will, like clouds, that will cover up and conceal this eclipse. So then they won't have the application of this being a negative sign that wasn't seen. So, in other words, the eclipse is there. The question is, will they or won't they see it? That's what the Gemara is saying. These four things create a negative environment where Hashem is going to show them a negative sign. If they're acting properly, they won't see it. The Rebbe said that's not a proper answer because, first of all, the Rebbe says in brackets, there's some places where there are almost never clouds, like in Egypt where there's no clouds, and that's why there isn't also rain. The Nile irrigates. But also, besides that, from the way what Chazal say, that what's the language of Chazal? That when the luminaries get eclipsed, get beaten, get smitten, in this case, what we're talking about is darkened, eclipse. When those luminaries get eclipsed, it's a proof that there's a negative sign. There's a negative sign being shown by Hashem. And so no, I'm sorry. So that language the Gemara uses shows that it's not about seeing it. It's speaking about when they are eclipsed. Then it's a bad sign. It's not talking about seeing it or not seeing it. And that's why the Gemara in the Breishis divides it into two divisions. He says that when the Yidden, he says like this: when the sun becomes eclipsed, it's a bad sign for the idolaters, for the non-Jews. When the moon gets smitten, it's a bad sign for the enemies of the Jews. That's a positive way of saying it's a bad sign for the Jews. He's calling them here a bad sign for the enemies of the Jews, to put it into positive language. Why is that? Because the sun is how the non-Jews count their time. Yisrael, Moinim, the Levana, the Jewish people count according to the moon. So if the moon is eclipsed, it's a sign for the Jewish people. If the sun is eclipsed, it's a sign for the non-Jews. So this is only, what does this mean? That since Bnei Yisrael are compared to the moon, the non-Jews to the sun, so the misdeeds of their behavior causes the eclipse. What Gemara seems to be saying clearly is that the respective misbehavior, whether the non-Jews or the Jews, causes either the sun or the moon to be eclipsed. So we understand that for that Gemara we understand, if the Yidden will act properly and perfectly, then there shouldn't be any eclipse whatsoever. The Gemara clearly says that the eclipse or not eclipse, not that we'll see it or won't see it. So that way of explaining it is not oisgehalten, doesn't hold water really. So then now in Beis Daled, chapter 4, the Rebbe says the explanation to this is simply when we say that the luminaries are smitten, it's a bad sign, and that comes because of these four things. So what we're saying is that when an eclipse happens, it's a sign that in that time there is power to a negative mazel, to a negative constellation. Just like we find in many places in Chazal that there's some time when it's not a good mazel. There's some negative energy. In other words, it's a time that's misugel. It's a time that's fitting or conducive. It's a time that's conducive to negativity, and this also causes that at that time, because it's a time that's conducive to there's negative energy, so to speak. So if those four things that the Gemara speaks about regarding eclipses, those four things were done, then God forbid there could be negative consequences, could be punishment. And that's why the Gemara says, but if don't worry about it, if you're doing the will of Hashem, then you have nothing to worry about because there's nothing to punish for. It's not that that time brings punishment. That time is conducive that if there's something wrong, it'll be punishable. If there's nothing wrong, then great, no problem. According to this, there's no room for the question about, well, yeah, since we know that it's embedded in, scientifically we know it's embedded within the laws of nature that at certain times there'll be an eclipse, and it has nothing to do with what people do or don't do. So this will explain it. This is only a time when it's a time conducive for punishment, and then what's punishable is those three things, those four things that the Gemara says are associated to eclipse. And indeed, these signs of negative energy connected with eclipse are predictable. They're put into embedded within the cycle of nature. Just like the Gemara says, for example, in Masechta Shabbos, somebody who's born on this day of the week will have a tendency to this and to that and so on. And we're going to, what do you mean? Based on what somebody's day of the week somebody's born is going to be good or bad? No, we're going to highlight this a little bit as we go on in the Sikha. This doesn't mean that we have choice, but let's go on and we'll see. Hey, chapter 5. Still, we need to explain. The Gemara says that there's a difference between Jews and non-Jews. It says that when Yisrael does the will of Hashem, then doesn't have to be scared of all this. Don't be scared of the signs of heaven because the non-Jews are scared about them. The non-Jews have to be scared. The Jewish people don't have to be scared. So what the Gemara is telling us clearly is that in that same situation where we're telling the Jew, don't be scared because they're not doing anything wrong, they're doing the will of Hashem, but still in all, by the non-Jews, we're saying, yes, they should be scared. We have to understand. If we're just saying it's a negative energy, it's like a bad sign, siman ra, and that's when, it's not that that itself is bad, but that's when things that were done bad are punishable. It's a time that's conducive for highlighting those negative things that are done and punishing for them. So why should the non-Jews need to be scared if they didn't do anything to transgress? So then that non conducive, that time that's conducive for negativity, but there's nothing negative to harp on. So what's the difference between Yisrael and non-Yisrael? Chapter Vav, chapter 6. The explanation is when we talk about the effect of mazel, of the constellation, of the energy in certain times. So it's not just regarding reward and punishment, that sometimes is a time when it's conducive to give reward, sometimes conducive to nitpick and sorry, I take back that word, nitpick. Sometimes it's a time to focus in and punish for certain negative things that other times may have been overlooked. So it's not just about that. No, it's also regarding the behavior of people that born under a certain mazel in a certain time of a certain energy causes a tendency to certain behavioral patterns, either good or not. For example, it says a person learns a majority, Chazal tell us a person learns a majority of his chokhmah by night. What does that mean? It means by day you can't be successful in studying Torah? No. It means that night has within it a certain conducivity to having success in Torah more than by day. And by day, you would need to exert yourself more to have that level of success. Similarly, all the things we quoted before in Masechta Shabbos, we didn't say them all, but it said if you're born on this day, you're going to have a tendency to that, and so on. That creates, yes, a tendency in the nature of the person who's born during those times. That doesn't mean to say that the mazel creates a result in the person that forces them to act in a particular way based on the time and on the constellation and on the zodiac that he was born in. Because I threw in zodiac, sorry. The Rebbe is it's the same concept, but the Rebbe is talking in particular about what the Gemara says in Shabbos. If you're born on this day, it's like this, and this day, it's like that. This means that doesn't force or create by default a certain behavior, because everybody has full right to govern and to choose their own deeds, to be a tzaddik or the opposite. And it's not possible to say that by nature a person is drawn to something that you can't that you can't change. The whole concept of choice is built on the fact that a person could choose what to do. So what does it mean when a person is born in a certain time? And the Gemara says, a person is born on this day is going to be like this. It means that the mazel and the energy of that time creates by the person a certain tendency. The Rebbe quotes here from the Pirish on the Rambam, the Lechem Mishnah, is a netiya ktsas, a minor tendency, a somewhat of a tendency to a particular behavior, to a particular style. However, through exertion, a person can overcome that tendency and act in a way that's different than his tendency. And he can even change his actual tendency, recreate it in a more positive way. According to similar to what's explained in great length in what is known as the 8 Prakim of the Rambam, Shmeina Prakim la Rambam. It's introduction, the Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avos. The Rambam writes there that it's impossible that a person is created with just a person of virtue. Sorry, Efsha. I'm going to read it. Just I don't want to. I'll read it in the Hebrew. It's possible a person should be created by nature a virtuous person or a person with lackings. It's only that in his nature there's a tendency or there is a conduciveness to virtue or lacking. So his nature doesn't force it. However, somebody who is created with a tendency or with being conducive, with fertile ground to be a person of great virtue, he will have to exert less to make that choice to be a person of virtue. It's more naturally ingrained. You'll have to make a choice, but it will be less of an exertion for him to make that choice, because his nature is predisposed towards that naturally. Of course, he can still choose to be the person opposite of virtue, not to use those predispositions. However, somebody who has a predisposition, who has a tendency or a nature that's conducive to lacking, so he's going to have to exert himself to become somebody of virtue. So you think that's not fair. So the Rabbi adds here in brackets. On the other hand, the fact that he needs to work so hard is also a proof that from heaven they've given him very big energies, very big powers. Just like bigger powers than the one who has a predisposition to good. Because there's a rule, according to the Fum Gamla Shichna, according to the camel, according to the strength of the camel, you load him up. Hashem knows exactly our strengths and our weaknesses, our predispositions, our natures, and he tells us to be good. So if he's telling us to be good and it's going to take a lot more exertion, it means he's also provided us with the energy, with the extra power that we need to become good, right? He knows exactly the whole situation. And therefore, similarly, in our Similarly, when it comes to particular character traits that come because of the time and the energy in which a person is born, even though the Gemara says anybody who's born on this day will be, that doesn't mean the Gemara doesn't mean that it must be that way. What the Gemara means is that it'll be more. He'll have more of a of a conducive, of a predisposition, of a natural inclination towards a certain thing, and he's going to need therefore more exertion to overcome that particular natural bent. Similarly, when we talk about the days, some days are good to start something, some days aren't good to start something. We're just saying that those days are more conducive for negativity, and that's why you have to work harder in order to save it, to guard yourself from particular things that may be more possible on a day that's not so positive. For example, there's a concept we don't start things on um, second day of the week and on the fourth day of the week and so on. But that's not imperative that those things will be will be negative. Why? We don't get worried because about these concepts. Um, I was just mentioning it in passing. It doesn't go into it in great detail. But the point that Rebbe brings here is that actually, even though we say we bring it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, don't start things on day 2 and day 4, because within creation there's certain aspects, right, that are from the 6 days of creation already show a susceptibility to certain aspect of negativity. But that's only, for example, when it's not going to cause us to delay a mitzvah. There's another rule that tells us never pass up a chance to do a mitzvah. Don't delay a mitzvah. So we'll say, well, I want to start the mitzvah on it's a Monday today. I don't want to start it today because maybe it's not such good energy. Hello, but there's a rule. Don't delay mitzvahs. So throw that thing out. Don't worry about what day it is. You have a mitzvah, do it. Similarly, if you're going to try a little harder, you can have success even on a day that's not prone to success. It's not inviting success. Doesn't matter. You can overcome that. You just have to try a little harder. So if you want what I'm saying is, you want a day that's got everything set up for it in a more positive way, choose this and this day. But anyway, this is it's a lengthy topic, but this is the crux of the general concept of it. Zion, chapter 7. According to this, we could say, what does it mean? Now that I was going to explain the Gemara, what does it mean when the luminaries are eclipsed? It's a bad sign to the world. So it's not just that it's, as we said before, it's not just that it's a time that's a time that's negative, because that's a time when Hashem will punish for those things, those 4 things that were done negatively. But no, also it's a time when the person's nature, it's a time that invites within people a certain negative tendency to do something not good. It's not forcing them to do something not good, because the person has the ability to overcome even things that he's prone to. And that's why whatever it says here in the square bracket, I'm going to jump back to the square bracket in a few seconds. And so what does the Gemara mean? The Gemara says, because of these 4 things, the sun is eclipsed. So it means not that the eclipse is caused because of this negative behavior in actuality. No, what the Gemara is saying is that because during these times there is a proneness, there's an energy that pushes towards these 4 negative behavior patterns. Because of that, it expresses itself in the eclipse of the heavenly bodies. In other words, the eclipse of the heavenly bodies is coming because of the energy that's embedded. Hashem planned it in advance, just like uh, yeah, just like if born on a certain day, there's this energy in creation where somebody who's born on a particular day of the week will have a tendency to do this and this. So what the Gemara is saying is that because there's this energy, this tendency on those particular days, that's why Hashem expresses it in an eclipse. So Bishvil, it's not because people have done these 4 bad things, But Bishvil, because of those four things that the energy, this time, this particular moment of eclipse, this is a time where there's an energy that will create a proneness, create a susceptibility to people to act in negative ways of these four particular items. That's because of that negative energy, that's why there's an eclipse. And that's why the Jewish people, is chapter Ches, that's why Jewish people don't have to worry, whereas the non-Jews do. Why? Even though also non-Jews can overcome the things that are embedded in nature, the proneness, the susceptibility, right? Those energies that are in nature that lead to a heightened possibility of doing the negative thing. Because even though they don't have the true concept of choice, however, that's a gift that's given to the Jewish people because of their neshama. But still, in all, they don't get punished unless they voluntarily sin. It's they're forced to do something wrong, they're not punished. However, since they are more controlled by the ways of nature, so therefore their level of exertion is going to have to be greater in order to cancel out this negative energy that's there in the eclipse. That's why, indeed, the non-Jews should fear from these times, because, in other words, those things that are embedded in the time that it can call out a negative behavior, they should be more scared of that because it may be more difficult for them to overcome that. However, Yidden, when they have, by them, there is an additional Avodas Hashem. They are given mitzvahs that take them to a higher, to higher than the limitations of their own nature. And the Gemara says when they do the will of Hashem, doing the will of Hashem, as the Rebbe quotes in a footnote, means they do b'chol ma'itcha, they do with all their might. So when they connect to Hashem in a way of doing the will of Hashem, in a way of b'chol ma'idecha, all their might, higher than limitations. So they rise higher than the limitations of nature. Even the limitations that already have been put in to the heavenly bodies that show that it's a negative time. And that's why they're not scared about it, because they'll be able to overcome that. Not just will they be able to overcome this nature through hard work, get rid of the nature, but they don't worry about it. They start on day 2 and on day 4 and so on, because you can overcome it till we reach. I have to research that. Sorry, I didn't look it up. Maschilim beis v'dalit. Exactly the details of that. Till you reach a matzav that you don't have to worry about nature at all. That's the way Hashem works with tzaddikim. That Hashem works with tzaddikim. The Rebbe quotes here in the Ha'ara 41, like Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, that his whole behavior was, Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa famously, his daughter said, came to her father Friday, he said, we don't have any oil, we couldn't afford oil for the Shabbos candle. He says, what do you have? He says, I only have vinegar. He says, light the vinegar. The same Hashem who said that oil should light will say that vinegar will light. So no difference. And it worked. So that's a tzaddik, like the Rebbe says, if you reach that level, and tzaddikim, really, all your people, all the Jewish people are tzaddikim, so then there can be a hanhoganisis, there can be a miraculous behavior that Hashem has higher than Teva. Go back to the parentheses that I skipped in the end of the previous eyes. But now the Rebbe says, now we can understand clearly the lashon that the mashal gives. The Gemara brings a mashal about the eclipse of the sun. It says it's a mashal to a parable to a king of flesh and blood who makes a meal for his students, and he places before them a torch. When he gets upset at them, he says to his servant, take away the torch. It doesn't say he takes away the torch. It tells his servant. In other words, taking away the torch gets done not through the king himself, but through his servant. Because the negativity that is created is being done through a servant, through nature, which is one of the tools of Hashem. So indeed, we've now explained the Gemara, it's indeed embedded within nature. However, why is it embedded within nature? Why is it a siman ra? because of these four negative energies, negative deeds, because of these four things that the negative energy exists during those times, Hashem creates an eclipse and portrays this negativity, and it's seen. It's a astronomical, predictable thing, because that's the simon, that's the mazel, that's the energy that exists during those times, and it expresses itself in the eclipse. This is the way the Rebbe explains the Gemara in the Sikha. Very interesting. The Gemara the Rebbe brings in the beginning of the Sikha, from Yare's Dvash, the book of Rabbi Yonis and Eibeshitz. When he explained this Gemara, he said that we're not talking. The Gemara is not talking about eclipse. It's talking about black dots, or certain times when there's um, black spots on the moon and sun. So that's a negative sign. So the Rebbe says, I didn't merit to understand his words. And the Rebbe writes in a star at the bottom, well known, by the way, that the author, Rabbi Yonis Eibeshitz, was forced into many debates with the secular sages of his time, the non-Jewish sages of his time, even well-known um, even well-known sages amongst the non-Jews, and look in various Gemaras. The Rebbe shares various times in Gemara where, when there were debates between Jewish scholars and non-Jewish scholars, sometimes the Jewish scholars didn't necessarily give a comprehensive answer. They gave an answer that was enough to deflect the question at that time. So the Rebbe says, I don't understand this answer. In other words, and in the star footnote, the Rebbe is saying, perhaps he didn't mean this to be the comprehensive answer. Also, he needed to answer the non-Jews. He had to debate. So what's the problem with that answer, though? First of all, the Rebbe says, who knows about those about those black spots? It's supposed to be a bad sign for the world. A sign is when you can see it. Two, some people now say that there's also a predictability in that. It's part of nature. With the black spots, it's not something that just jumps out of nowhere. Three, says the Rebbe, this pirish is against the simple reading of the understanding of the concept, and against many of the mefarshei Hashas. And so, that would be a relearning of the sugya, taking it out of its simple context. And four, when the Gemara gave the analogy that it's like a king taking away the torch, letting them sit in the darkness. So that means that obviously we're talking about the eclipses, because even if it's because it still has the same effect. Even it doesn't matter if it's predictable or not. You're sitting in the darkness. So obviously the Gemara is talking about eclipse. Yeah. So then there's another answer that Rebbe quotes from a book called Chaste David, who explains it. Tosefta says that the Chachamim are talking about sometimes it happens unpredictably, when it's not planned. So then it's a sign that then it's definitely a sign. So Rebbe says, but besides for the previous questions, which also question 3 and 4 apply to this here also, Rebbe says, when did that ever happen? And the Gemara says that for four things, for example, a Av Basin wasn't properly eulogized. This negative sign comes to the world, that definitely would have happened more than once. We never see that there's an unpredictable eclipse that happened. It's always just an astronomical phenomena. So those answers, Rebbe said, are not I'm not going to answer the question. And there's another answer that Rebbe brings from the Shalah. The Shalah says that when we talk about rainbow, so we talk about in the book of Noach, right, that the rainbow is a sign that Hashem wanted to destroy the world. But rainbows are a scientific phenomena, right? And the same thing will be, what about, how can a eclipse be a negative sign? It's a scientific phenomenon. So the Shalah answers that Hashem predicted it in advance. Hashem knew already when there will be sins that will invite an eclipse, and that's the way that the astronomical circulation was created. And it's not a problem to say that Hashem knows in advance the sins, yet there's still free choice, as I've said at length elsewhere. And the Rebbe says in square brackets here, this is in footnote 15. Yeah, that This is sweetened. This will be understood according to what the Middle Rebbe writes in the book of Teres Chaim, that indeed the even the sins are already known by Hashem and they're according to Hashem's plan. Um, However, it's a difficult concept to understand. We can't understand it, but that's been dealt with elsewhere. But here the problem is to explain eclipses like this would be problematic. You know why? Because we know a concept in the beginning of Tanya, we quote this, that when a child is born, the Gemara says, it says he's going to be wise or not wise, rich or poor, but it doesn't say he's going to be a tzaddik or a rasha. It doesn't say. Hashem knows, but he doesn't say. Because when something is said, it kind of creates the reality. So here, even more so, if you're talking about setting up an astronomical reality, so then that's already forcing, it's already bringing into the physical dimension the sin that's going to happen. Then that's a problem with free choice. So the Rebbe says that's not going to explain the Gemara here in this case. And the Rebbe explains as we just quoted the Rebbe. Thank you. Sei gesund.